And we've only got one more class in this quarter, and then we'll, I only have one more class because I'll be gone next Sunday preaching up in North Sumner. So we're going to finish Wednesday night. The flow, so that we keep this in mind, is he starts off with his introduction, and then he discusses how we have the divine nature. And we talked about these are the attributes of God. And the reason why I believe he is doing that is because you have these false teachers that are coming along and saying, we've got something better. But it is these divine natures that's going to keep us from sinning and keep us fruitful. If we have these, if they're increasing, then we won't fall and we won't be short. And then he goes into his own death that is about to happen. And from that, we have him going to how you have the apostles and then you have the prophets. And let me turn that off. That was from somebody that I need to give some material to. And so you go from the apostles, Peter, and then the prophets. And so we've got this flow from we have the divine nature. This helps us from that perspective to not sin. And we saw where he put knowledge. It's at the bottom of this, quote, ladder. And why he was probably using this ladder was a rhetorical device. Then he goes to the true teachers, the apostles and the prophets, and discusses what prophecy is, which leads us to discuss what the false prophets are. How many of you have ever seen a counterfeit bill? Janet, Bruce, Frank, okay, anybody else? Okay, how many of you can tell by looking at a counterfeit bill that it's counterfeit? Janet and Bruce? Can't now? You have a marker? Yeah. So there are ways to tell. Nowadays, if you have, it's a $20 bill on up, they mark it because of people putting out counterfeit bills. When Janet and I moved to Kentucky, she had to teach them how to see what a counterfeit bill was, to identify it. And you probably know this. What is the method to know if something is counterfeit? Janet? Yeah. The only way that you could tell something is counterfeit back then was by comparing it to that which was authentic. And that's an illustration that's been used many, many times. The only way that you can tell whether a false teacher is false is by comparing him to the authentic. The authentic teachers, their lives, and what they taught. And that is the purpose of Peter saying, this is me, these are the prophets. Now let's look at the counterfeits. Yes?
You also have to watch and look at them as you're counseling them, going through them fast. So you apply that, what you're saying, as you're going through life, you're going through experiences, and you're going through what people are teaching. You have to be able to watch, which means reading the Word, as to what is authentic instead of just reading through.
Yeah, the more familiar we are with the Word of God, the more protected we are from false teachers. Okay, let's look at chapter 2 in the false teachers. I briefly went over how I outlined it Wednesday night, and now we're going to go over it this morning. The marks of a false teacher. You've got your method, verses 1, 3, and 18. The message, verses 1 and 15. The manner of life, verses 2, 10, 13, and 14. And the motivation, verses 3 through 15. Now, we're going to go back through those as we read the text. Chapter 2. There were indeed false prophets among the people, just as there will be false teachers among you. He is going back to the history of Israel and Judah, where they did have false teachers. For example, Jeremiah said that Babylon would come and take everyone away, and yet there were false prophets that were saying the exact opposite. Sometimes a prophet is a false prophet, and we know that because they only want to comfort. But they will bring in destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them. One of the things that I do, and I'll share this with you, when I'm trying to decide if a doctrine is false or true, I usually try to get back to the basics. For example, how many of you have ever heard of the AD 70 theory? Anybody? Okay, Johnny, do you know enough about it to say what it's about? Because it's complicated. Yes. Yeah. And so because of that, there is no more sin, death, or anything. Now, we look at that and we can say, well, that's pretty idiotic. But there's a lot of people that have fallen for this false doctrine. I mean, the whole idea, there is no more death anymore. How many funerals have I gone to since I've been here? It's been over 15, I'm guessing. And yet they want to say that, there is no death because Jesus said that he would destroy death. Well, I'm still seeing it, Janet. Here is one of the problems with the AD 70 theory. You can't really finalize what they're saying because it is so convoluted. But this is what I did. I had a friend who was involved in the 70 AD theory. And one of the doctrines is that the resurrection has already happened. Jesus came in AD 70 and the resurrection happened. Now, the Bible teaches that there's still a resurrection to come at the second coming. But AD 70 theory says that the resurrection has already occurred. Well, my friend, he was involved in 70 AD theory. And so what I would do is I would go back and just simply say, what's the gospel? Because they're saying there is no more of a resurrection. But what does the gospel include? The resurrection of Jesus and our resurrection. So when you are trying to decide if a doctrine is false or true, and here they're bringing in these destructive heresies and denying the master. I mean, how could they do that? You've got to go back to what the gospel is, the simplicity of it, because often these destructive heresies are going to be contrary to that. And one of the ways that they started to deny the master in those days was denying his humanity, because they said that he wasn't truly flesh. But this will bring a swift destruction on them. We could see that their false doctrine, which teaches destructive heresies, is actually going to hurt them. Many will follow their depraved ways, and the way of truth will be maligned because of them. Not only are they going to live a lifestyle that is contrary to the gospel, they're going to be basically mocking and maligning those that are following the gospel. And you keep on going, and it says, they will exploit you in their greed with made-up stories. Their condemnation pronounced long ago is not idle, and their destruction does not sleep. And so we find that they are going to take advantage of people in their greed. How many of you, and maybe you can give some illustrations, because I don't need to do all the talking, especially since, if you can't tell, I'm having trouble. How many of you have seen or heard of people today who are very greedy, and they're actually taking advantage of the people that are in their audience, their church, or in their TV audience, and so they're just getting rich off of others. Anybody hear stories like that? You got a story, Ashley, or a particular person?
There's like a handful of televangelists, but like one that pops in my head is Joel Osteen. Like his churches keep getting bigger and bigger, but his buildings keep getting bigger, and then he has so many cars and so many planes and helicopters, and like you don't need all that stuff.
Yeah. There was one preacher who needed a private jet because God told him he didn't need to ride with the common people. And unfortunately, that's common. Yes.
I know for a fact Joyce Myers has somebody hold an umbrella over her and another one to fan her.
Okay, so it was Hugh.
Seeing Tammy Faye on TV, how made up she is and how she tries to keep the aging process at bay. So that's an example. Also, I'm just thinking in general, the people who preach that once you've been saved, you can't fall from grace. And it's really nice. It's a nice feeling to say, well, I've been saved, so I can't ever. I'm going to heaven. There's no way. Anything can happen. I can't do anything to stop me from going to heaven.
There's a song by Hank Williams Jr. I can't remember the title of it, but it's got a hilarious line in it where he says that the preacher on TV says, send your money to God, but he always gives you his address. Maybe I should sing that song at one of your jams, because it's hilarious.
I think Ray Stevens had one with Jesus wear a Rolex on his television show.
I heard that one too. Maybe I need to pick that one back up. Yes, sir.
We're talking about televangelists, but let's talk about us. Let's talk about the people that are not evangelists, but they use religion as a way to further themselves. This is personal to me. I don't know these people, but every time I see cross-shaped construction, I get a chill up and down my spine.
As in, what would be a cross?
Construction,
Right.
Associating like they have a special unction from God.
Okay.
To do what they do. Like they're more honest than anybody else because they follow in the footsteps of Jesus. And to me, it's sacrilegious.
Yeah, we should be able to have our life be the message, so we don't have to go around telling people how good we are.
We want to be careful that we include every false teacher, be they in the pulpit or by example in life.
Yeah. Hugh.
Sometimes it's not money that drives them. It's
Prestige thing, yeah.
It's prestige, or it's just the fact they want to innovate, they want to get something new in the church, they want to, that we haven't done this before, let's do that. They want to innovate things, stir things up. And sometimes it is for their prestige, just to say, oh, I did that.
Yeah. Barb.
It's actually brings up Olstein. There are a lot of people that are drawn in or are attracted to his feel-good ministry, if you will, if you can call it that. But the ones I'm concerned about is even amongst us. It's my greater concern. Even among our teachers, I want us to think about those of the past that we think, well, we should have paid closer attention to some we let in the classrooms. I'm saying even here, among us. as I think about what Paul warned the Ephesian elders, what does he tell them to do? He says, pay careful attention to yourselves. But what he said, for he did not shrink back from declaring the whole counsel of God in Acts chapter 20. But then he says, I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And those are the ones that come in under the radar that we don't pay close attention to. We look at the ones outside and say, boy, we can point them out easily. But we each need to know our own, and we need to understand what it is, their motivation, and whether they're truly seeking the whole counsel of God or trying to help tickle others' ears.
Yeah. Having said that, this morning's sermon you might not like, so thanks for the introduction. And everybody's now scared. Oh no, what's Perry going to say? But hopefully when I say it, you'll be able to determine whether or not it's false or true. Because every preacher, every teacher, every Christian has to say some things that people don't like. Because this is the standard. And not something, it's like tonight, it's a fourth Sunday, so I'm doing a sermon. And so I'm going to do a review of my day at the campus on Thursday. I'll just say one thing and then we're going to go on. I used his logic, his thinking, and got him to agree that a counter position could be just as true as the one he was presenting based upon the logic that he was using. And he just said, yes, but I agree, but I like this one. And I said, you're not the standard. So, yes.
There's a word down in verse 10 that's important in this discussion we're having about all this, and it is authority.
Yes, despise authority.
Authority for the things we're doing, we're wrong.
Yeah. Let's go through these marks. Okay, the method, because we see in verse 1 that they bring in destructive heresies. They deny the master. You look at those two and you think, there's no way I would ever fall for anything like that. It is so obvious if it's destructive heresies and it's denying the master. Yet, do they influence people? They did. So we have to look not just at the false teachers, we have to look at the false listeners too. Look at verse 3. They will exploit you in greed with made-up stories. This story is contrary to what Peter said in chapter 1, verse 16. We did not follow cleverly contrived myths. I was having a discussion with somebody, and this might be a loose connection of what this idea of the story is, but hopefully it will fit. And it was on a particular topic, and the topic doesn't matter, but at the end of them presenting their case and me presenting my case, I looked at the third person who wanted us to talk. I said, did you notice how they quoted these outside sources and they never quoted Scripture? I said, I quoted Scripture. Now, that doesn't mean you don't use and can't use outside sources. I mean, history and things like that really help us up. But when you're making up stories to become something different, then that's a method that they go through. Look down in verse 18. For by uttering boastful, empty words. That's another thing that they do. So you've got a lot of fancy preaching going on. You know, they've got these fancy words, they've got these fancy stories, and you don't realize it, but they're leading you away from the gospel. That is their method. Yes?
This speaks greatly to the health and wealth gospel. That's so popular.
Very much so. Have y'all ever had a sermon on the health and wealth gospel here? The health and wealth gospel? Have you ever heard a sermon against the health and wealth gospel? Might be better with no. Okay, Janet, remind me.
That one very.
It's been talked about.
Taught Bible classes. It is far more deep than what you realize. And I didn't realize how deep it was until somebody requested that I preach on it. And I think I did one or two lessons. I can't remember if it was 2 or 1. So their method, they're going to be entertaining, easy to listen to. I mean, they've got these stories, they've got these fancy words, and you don't realize that their message, which we're going to be getting to, is evil. But I don't know how to put it other than they're easy to listen to. Now, does this mean that if you're easy to listen to, you're automatically a false teacher? No. There are some wonderful preachers out there. Have you ever heard a preacher and he preached for a quote, long time, and then when he finished, you looked at the clock or the watch and said, wow, that went by fast. And there are some preachers that are just gifted by God like that. But if you're going to entertain, or if you're going to bring in false teaching, it's easier if your method is one of being entertaining. Yes, Anthony.
Most of these false teachers are more motivational speakers rather than speaking from the word itself.
Very good. You're correct. They're using more psychology than they are Scripture. And that's something we have to be aware of. So their message, yes, Frank, Mark.
The rest of that verse, though, kind of draws the attention to the enticement that Satan used in the garden. And going back to your Genesis account, you like to pull out a lot from, but as they're speaking, they're doing it by enticing their sensual pleasures of the flesh. So it's not something that you would hear in everyday conversation, but it's something more alluring that will draw you in that wouldn't normally not work for everyday audience, if you will.
Yeah.
So when you think about how these false teachers are able to attract them, he caught them where they were at their weakest point, and that's what Satan does. And we've got to be on guard for that. But they were more than just speaking with eloquent words of, well, that's pretty sharp. That's a smart individual. But yet they're drawing them in by things they want to hear and know.
Absolutely. That's why when we look at the false teachers, we have to, as Frank was talking about, look at false listeners too. We have to look at ourselves. A false teacher is only successful because of the false listeners. Let's look at the message. Verse 1, we talked about this a little bit, destructive heresies and denying the master. So they're denying the gospel, and you think, well, how could anybody want to accept that? Go down to verse 15. They have gone astray by abandoning the straight path and have followed the path of Balaam, the son of Beor, who loved the wages of wickedness. So when I'm saying this is the message, the point I'm making right now is how it is contrary to the original message. Let's look at the manner of life, and we can see how this goes into their false message that they were teaching, they were also living. Verse 2, depraved ways, and not only that, they malign those that are teaching the gospel. Look at verse 10. Especially those who follow the polluting desires of the flesh and despise authority. Look at verse 13. They will be paid back with harm for the harm they have done. They consider it a pleasure to carouse in broad daylight. They are spots and blemishes, delighting in their deceptions while they feast with you. Verse 14. They have eyes full of adultery. They never stop looking for sin. They seduce unstable people. They have hearts trade in greed. They are children under a curse. So when you look at their life, how does that life exhibit itself as contrary to what the gospel is?
Versus sacrifice.
Very much so. The message that they were teaching led to this manner of life. And this manner of life, would you say that it was very spiritually oriented or very fleshly oriented? Very fleshly. Do you think it is possible for somebody to pick a church to go to nowadays because the message allows them to live however they want? Well, you see this. This is what the teachers are saying, hey, yeah, you can do that. Look at me, I'm doing this. They're living contrary to the gospel. Yes, you.
In verse 14, right in the word, cursed children, does that indicate that they are members of the church that have started to teach this and do this? And I'm just wondering if that word children means children of God that once were children of God.
It could. What I think it means here is that it's, you know how, Paul wrote that they were, children of wrath. And it's not that they were born that way, but they became that way. And here you've got children under a curse. I'm wondering, and this is just me, thinking out loud on this. You've got, if we look at the stories that Peter uses, you've got the angels who sinned. Verse 4. You've got the people during the days of Noah. You've got Sodom and Gomorrah, including Lot. And so you have the destruction of these people using these Old Testament stories, and maybe even one that's not even in the Old Testament, the angels. Did children ever suffer a curse because of the false prophets that existed in Israel? Yeah. So maybe that is what it is referring to. Or who knows? Maybe it's it goes back to Genesis chapter 3. Yes, Gordon.
Some of this language makes me think of the children in Jeremiah's time, where even the leaders, the priests and the prophets were wicked to lead the children astray.
Yes, you're correct. When I say Genesis chapter 3, I'm going to read you verse 15. I will put hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring or your children and her children. He will strike your head and you will strike his heel. I wonder if that could go back all the way to Genesis, that they are the children of the serpent, and that they are under a curse. Yes.
It makes me think of what I've seen on TV with drag queens going into classrooms where there are little children, and it is just repulsive and so sinful, and we put up with it. And as a matter of fact, I heard that there was money in this last bill that was funded to support drag queens.
I would not be surprised. Yeah, would not be surprised. So one of the ways that you can tell if somebody is a false teacher or a true teacher is look at their life. Their message is going to lead to a certain lifestyle. That's the point, I think. And that's logical, isn't it? Shouldn't the message lead to a certain lifestyle? Yeah. Does the gospel message in its purity lead to a lifestyle? Yes. So if you're teaching something contrary to the gospel, then it's going to lead to a lifestyle contrary to that gospel. Yes, Mark.
As you think about what that seems to look like, is verse 4 is talking about those of the past of the Old Testament that have committed these horrific sins and wrongs. And it goes on to talk about it in verse 11 as well. It seems like this is confirmation that no matter what they think they have accomplished, they will be judged at the end of the day, just like these folks will be judged. So that's a period coming that is awaiting on those who bring about these false doctrines and teaching contrary to what they had already been taught.
When you look at the angels, and I'm one of the people that believes that Satan or the devil originally was an angel. And people say, well, you can't prove that. Maybe I can't. But you do have in 2 Peter and Jude angels that did sin against God. Now, can I explain all of this? No. How do you sin if you're in heaven? I don't know. But I don't think that's the point that Peter's going to. You look at these angels. Is that a pretty exalted place to be? Yeah. You look at the stories of the Old Testament, were angels pretty powerful? Yeah. So they're exalted, they're powerful. So did their power and exaltation save them? Nope. They decided to go against that. Look at the motivation of these false teachers. Then we're going to go through the text verse by verse. Verse 13, they will exploit you in their greed. And verse 15, they are following the path of Balaam, who loved the wages of wickedness. You look at a lot of false teachers, and I'm not going to say this is true across the board, but a lot of false teachers, they're doing pretty good. They got a lot of ching, and that's one of their motivations. Do you think it's possible for a preacher to change what he teaches and preaches based upon his support? Yeah. How many of you think that I've ever been faced with that temptation? I have been. And it's like I've told Janet many times, well, this might be my last sermon here. I've got a friend who was a preacher, and he was also an elder, and his life has changed somewhat, and he's not either one of those anymore, even though he's still a very good Christian. And he's teaching 1 Corinthians, and Paul wasn't paid, and he says, I feel so free now that I can say whatever I think is true, and I don't have to worry about my support. Now, these preachers, who's making them rich? Yeah, they're listeners. So we go back to the false listeners. These false teachers, they're making all of this cha-ching, but they're getting it from the false listeners, why are the false listeners willing to give them all of this money? They're getting what they want to hear. So here you've got these false teachers. They're making tons of money. But it's based upon the false listeners who are willing to support it. Gordon.
To make sure those things that are said are true.
That's correct. They're not going back to what the original is. So we can see their method, we can see their message, we can see their manner of life, we can see their motivation. Yes, Hugh.
I don't think you're going to skip it, but I want to make sure that one of Peter's messages is they're going to be punished. Wasn't the people of Lot's time punished?
Yes.
The people of Noah's time punished? Weren't the angels punished? Even the angels were punished. These false teachers, don't worry about it, they will be punished.
And who will be punished along with them? Like the false listeners. That's right. So let's begin in verse 3. They will exploit you in their greed with made-up stories. And then here comes the part that you wanted us to get to. Their condemnation, pronounced long ago, is not idle, and their destruction does not sleep. I think that's interesting that their condemnation pronounced long ago is not idle, and their destruction does not sleep, because later on in chapter 3, there's going to be some false teachers who say, where is the promise of his coming? And that, he says, God is patient, waiting for everybody to repent. So not only is the second coming, you have to be patient for it, but it's a reality that is coming. So is the destruction of these false teachers. So, and then we're going to get into examples. For if God did not spare the angels who sinned, but cast them into hell, we know that Matthew says that God made hell, created hell, originally for the fallen angels. The word hell here is probably in your translation, but does anybody have a different word? Okay. Maybe Hades. Anybody got a different word? Tartarus. Yeah. That's the Greek word. And if I understand correctly, that just goes back to a mythological story that the place of punishment in these myths was called Tartarus. So Peter is going to use that and say, okay, I'm going to take your made-up stories, remember? And I'm going to show you that you're going to be suffering. Just using words that they used. So if God didn't spare the angels who sinned but cast them into Tartarus, which shows us there's different words for eternal destinations, and delivered them into chains of utter darkness to be kept for judgment, which is interesting. It's telling us that they're in Tartarus right now, or hell, if that's how your translation reads it, or in this place of punishment, right? Do they know what their eternal destination is? Yeah. But it still says they're waiting on what? Yeah, the judgment to come. I guess they're going to be judged at the second coming, just like we're going to be judged at the second coming. But when people die, wherever they go, they already know what their fate is, just waiting for the final statement from the judge. And if he didn't spare the ancient world, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, when he brought the flood on the world of the ungodly, and if he reduced the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes and condemned them to extinction, making them an example of what is coming to the ungodly, and if he rescued Lot, distressed by the depraved behavior of the immoral, for as that righteous man lived among them day by day, his righteous soul was tormented by the lawless deeds he saw and heard. Then the Lord knows how to rescue the godly from trials and to keep the unrighteous under punishment for the day of judgment, especially those who follow the polluting desires of the flesh and despise authority. So what Peter is doing is he's giving them examples and said, look, God has already told you what he's going to do. And they could not have witnessed the angels being sent to Taurus. That's in the other realm. And they're going to bring up the false teachers, the flood. They're going to bring it up in chapter 3 again. Because they're going to say, where's proof of his coming? The world has been the same as it always has been. And Peter's going to say, you've forgotten about the flood. Which means, again, that they're going away from this. But here you've got this example. The angels, they couldn't witness that. But again, how powerful and exalted the angels they were. And yet God did not spare them when they decided to turn away. And then you've got the entire world. However many were in it, we do not know. I do not think it was a local flood. You'll hear that a lot. Again, I think that's getting away from what this is. It was a worldwide flood. And you look at it, when he brought the flood on the world of the ungodly, if it was just a local flood, that's not really that big of a deal. But it's the whole world. But what did God do? He saved some. So you've got this message being intermingled. I want you to know who the false teachers are. You need to beware of the false teachers. Do not be a false listener. But God knows how to rescue. And that kind of goes back to 1 Peter, doesn't it? 1 Peter, the suffering and the judgment was coming from outside sources. Persecution. 2 Peter is coming from inside. But whether the pressure is from the outside or the inside, God can save you. God can protect you. You look at Noah. Does he look like a very successful preacher? He saved his family and that's it. Don't know how long he preached, but he's a preacher of righteousness. And I'll admit that kind of gives me some comfort. Because sometimes things aren't going as well or as fast as I would like for them to go. But hey, Noah preached all that time and got his family in that ark, that boat, and that was it. Sometimes we look at Lot and we say, oh, he wasn't a very good character because Abraham offered him any direction. And Lot chose the good. He should have said, Abraham, you take it. That's the better. And then he lives in Sodom and think, how could he live with all those? Why didn't he just leave? And it's easy to dismiss Lot. Yes, Jesse?
He preached 120 years.
Yeah. Going back to Genesis chapter 6, that's what a lot of people, and that might be correct, that when it says that my presence or spirit will be them for 120 years, that Noah preached for 120 years. So thank you. Yeah. So that could be how long he preached. And he didn't save very many. Johnny.
So I think it's below 100. It says that Noah was 500 years old and his sons were born. That's when God pronounced, the destruction of the earth. And he was 600 years old when he entered the ark. So actually it was built within 100 years.
Oh boy, numbers.
It's a long
Long time.
That's a safer number.
Hugh.
Think about he saved his family.
He did.
And a lot of us know that we have family members that are not.
Yeah.
And we couldn't do anything about it. And they just are not saved. And we don't. We think about it all the time and it drives us crazy.
Absolutely. And when we look at Lot, I want us to maybe have a different
Perspective on him. Like I said, sometimes we just say, yeah, how selfish he was. He stayed in a place that he shouldn't have stayed. But here it says he was tormented by what he saw. And it says that he was a righteous man. Mark.
I'm with you on that. People want to pile on Lot, but how little do we know about how he was influenced even with the people around him in his own personal family that might have directed his attention to go elsewhere. And even at that, we say, well, Lot was the leader, but how many of other leaders have been influenced by their families? Eli, different ones. Think about that.
If I remember the story of Lot correctly, one of the accusations against him was that, he would sit in the gate and judge them. So is it possible somebody is in a difficult spot, not because they are morally weak themselves, but because they're trying to influence people, teach people? So we have to be careful when we judge people, too. And so, but the point is, did God rescue him? Yes. And then when you look at Sodom and Gomorrah, that's another example of his judgment on these people. Well, we've kind of covered in a broad way the rest of chapter 2. We'll maybe read it and make some comments on Wednesday and get into chapter 3. I need to know, somebody tell me after services. The 31st is the last Sunday of the month, but we don't start the quarter on the next Wednesday if it's the first one, correct? It's always first. Okay, so we do have another class. Okay, that's what I was thinking, but I wasn't sure. Okay. Thank you very much, which means I can go slower now. I've got all kinds of time.